I actually am an accidental author, I guess. I didn't set out to be an author. I got it kind of backwards. I was a father. I wanted to write a story for my two little girls, something that would express my love to them, and something that would last. And so I thought if I put the story in book form, someday they might understand the depth of a father's love. And this is where the miracle began, because as I began to write this story began to write itself. It would wake me up in the middle of the night or early in the morning. Once I pulled off the freeway and wrote an entire chapter on the back of bills and envelopes and whatever paper I could find in the car at the time. And it was really peculiar because the story did not come in a linear sense, like from chapter 1 to chapter 2. It came like a jigsaw puzzle, where I had pieces here and there, but I wasn't really sure what the story was about until one very incredible morning. One morning at 4 in the morning, the story woke me up, and I went out to the kitchen table and began to write. And just a few sentences in, I was suddenly overcome with emotion as I understood for the first time that this story was about. That it was about the pain my mother felt over losing a child. At that moment, I had a very profound experience. I believed I was not alone in the room. I believed that I was with my little sister. And I said out loud, "Sue, you gave me this story for Mom." Sue died when I was 2 years old. And instantly it came to my mind, in the same way the story had come to my mind, dedicate this book to me. Now at this point I had no intentions of publishing the story, but I knew I needed to share it with more than just my two daughters. So I went to a local Kinko's copy center, and I made 20 copies, and came back and gave the first copy to my wife Carrie and asked her to read it and tell me what she thought of my book, not realizing what an intimidating thing this is to do to a wife, because either I have to be a good writer or she has to be a good liar. So Carrie tried to get out of it, and I finally said, "Honey, you don't have to read my book. Read the first 3 pages. If you don't like it, don't read it." So she started to read, and she kept reading and reading and reading, and around midnight, there were tears streaming down her cheeks. She finished the book, set it aside, and said nothing. Of course, I'm filled with anticipation. I said, "Honey, what did you think?" And she fell over on the couch, and she began to cry really hard. And then when she gained her composure, she said something that I think the men in the room will understand. She said, "Rick, where did you get that story?" The women in the room understand that as well, don't you? And then I told her about that morning, the experience I had had, and she said something really beautiful. She said, "It makes me want to be a better mother." Well, a few nights later, on Christmas Eve, I had the privilege of giving that book to my own mother and to my siblings, my brothers, and that was it. That was it. I was done. I felt wildly successful. I had set out to make 2 copies. I now had 20 in print. The next day, I received a phone call from one of my brothers, and I come from a family with 7 boys. So I expected something like, "Rick, I want you to know you have very poor punctuation." Instead, he said, "Your little book has changed my life." The next day, I received a similar phone call, and the next day, and the next day, and 3 weeks later, a woman called and said, "Mr. Evans, I want to tell you what your story means to me." And I asked, "Who are you? And where did you get my book?" And I realized at that point that my book had been passed beyond my realm of family and friends, that people were sharing these 20 copies. And so I took a notepad and started to track down those copies, and as near as I could tell, in the 4 weeks since I had handed out those 20 copies, they had been read more than 160 times. Well, a few weeks after that, I received a phone call from a manager at a bookstore. And the clerk at the bookstore had been going down the Salt Lake City white pages, calling all the Richard Evanses. And there's 14 of us in Salt Lake. So by the time she got to me, she had been rejected a fair number of times. She just said, "Hello, Mr. Evans, did you write a Christmas story?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, good. Where do we order it?" I said, "You can't order it. The book's never been published." She said, "But we've had 10 orders for it this week." That's pretty good for any book, but for a Christmas book in February, that's unheard of. "Maybe you should publish your book." And I thought, well, maybe I should, because the kinds of responses I was having. So I started to send my book out to publishers who wasted very little time in rejecting the book. I have a nice stack of rejection letters. A book like this will never sell. But I was still receiving so many requests that I decided I would self-publish the book. I knew nothing about publishing, but I knew I needed to share it. And so I brought the book out. And within 6 weeks, it became the best-selling book in my home state of Utah. The next year, I took some very great risks, and I took the book out nationally And by Christmas Eve, by December 1st of 1994, we had managed to ship 250,000 copies.